I've been working the night shift at a Dollar Tree in my town for a few months now. It's always been a pretty chill job, even though the store is in a somewhat isolated area and things get pretty slow at night. But last Wednesday, something happened that completely shook up my routine. A man came into the store acting really weird, walking back and forth, looking up at the security cameras, and stuffing things into his jacket pockets. It was so obvious he was shoplifting, so I did what I was supposed to do, called security and reported it to the police. They showed up pretty quickly and took the guy away, even though he was yelling something I couldn't quite make out. I figured it was just a strange night, but I had no idea things would escalate. The next night started off normal until the store phone rang, which doesn't happen much that late. I picked up, and this guy on the other end asked straight to the point, "What time do you close tonight?" At first, I didn't think much of it because, well, people call to ask stuff like that sometimes. I gave him the closing time and went back to my tasks. But for some reason, that call left me with this uneasy feeling. Later, as closing time approached, something else caught my attention. A black car pulled into the parking lot and stopped way off in a dark corner, where the lights barely reached. I waited, thinking someone would get out, but no one ever did. For a few minutes, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was someone waiting for a friend or just taking a break, but the longer that car stayed there, the more it got under my skin. I kept glancing out the window, trying to be discreet, but the whole thing felt off. My mind immediately went back to the guy who'd been arrested the night before. I didn't have any proof it was him, but the idea stuck, and my nerves were all over the place. When it came time to close up, I was a wreck. The thought of walking out to my car with that black car still parked there freaked me out, and now the headlights were on, almost like they were aimed at the store. I grabbed my phone and called the police again. I told them what was happening, though I didn't have any solid evidence to say it was connected to the incident from the night before. I just knew something didn't feel right, and I didn't want to take any chances. While I waited for the police to arrive, every second felt like an hour. I stayed near the front door, trying to keep it together, but my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. I couldn't stop staring at that car. When I finally saw the red and blue lights of the patrol cars lighting up the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief. 2 officers got out and started walking toward the black car, but as soon as they got close, the car's engine roared to life, and it sped off so fast that its tires screeched against the pavement. The cops tried to chase it, but the car was gone in seconds. When they came back, they asked if I had any idea who it might have been. I told them about the guy who was arrested the night before, but without any solid details, there wasn't much they could do besides make a report. They assured me they'd keep an eye on the area during the night shifts, but that didn't exactly make me feel safe. The thought of someone watching me or waiting for the right moment was enough to keep me on edge. After the police left, I locked up the store as quickly as I could and darted to my car, checking over my shoulder the whole way. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, even though there was no sign of anyone. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat there in silence, trying to calm down. But I couldn't stop thinking about how that car just sat there, how it sped off, and how close it all felt. My mind kept going in circles, and I barely slept that night. The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't work there anymore. Maybe it sounds dramatic to some people, but the fear I felt wasn't something I could just brush off. I called my manager and quit that same morning. Even now, whenever I drive past that Dollar Tree, I get this sick feeling in my stomach. I haven't seen that car since, and no one's reached out or tried to follow me. But the memory of that night still haunts me. The worst part is not knowing what would have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. It was just another regular workday, and I didn't think much of it when I decided to swing by Dollar Tree during my break. I needed a few basics like pens and sticky notes since I was running low at my desk. The place was quiet, as usual, with that weird mix of plastic and paper smell in the air. I grabbed a basket, gave a quick hey to the cashier, and started walking through the aisles. I already knew exactly what I needed, so I wasn't planning to take long. But as I browsed the stationery section, I noticed this guy with a big backpack standing a few feet away. He looked like he was checking out some items, but something about him felt off, like he was paying more attention to me than to the products. I tried to shake it off because, honestly, sometimes you're just being paranoid, right? But as I moved to the next aisle, he followed. There he was again. At first, I thought it might just be a coincidence, but the unease started creeping in. He wasn't really looking at anything on the shelves. He was just standing there, keeping a distance but clearly aware of where I was. My heart started racing a bit, but I acted like I hadn't noticed. I didn't want to give away that I was getting uncomfortable, just in case he really was up to something. I decided to test it. I walked to the back of the store, where the cleaning supplies are reamy, and pretended to look at a bunch of sponges. Sure enough, within a minute, he showed up again, standing even closer this time. My stomach sank. This wasn't normal. I grabbed my basket and headed straight for the register, trying not to glance back. As the cashier rang up my stuff, I caught a glimpse of the guy through the front window. He was standing outside now, staring directly at the entrance, like he was waiting for me to come out. That's when I knew for sure. He was following me. My hands were shaking as I paid. I stuffed everything into the bag as fast as I could, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I didn't want to leave the store alone, and honestly, I wasn't even sure what to do. My car was in the parking lot, but walking out there by myself didn't feel like an option. That's when I thought of texting a coworker to come pick me up. Luckily, he answered right away and said he was on his way. While I waited, I sat on a bench near the checkout, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I couldn't stop glancing out the window. That guy was still there, completely still, just watching the door like he was waiting for the right moment. When I finally saw my coworker's car pulling up, I felt a wave of relief. I got up quickly and made my way straight to the passenger side. As soon as I got in, I told him, "Let's go," barely able to get the words out. Only when we started driving away did I glance back and see the man still standing at the corner of the store, watching us leave. My coworker kept asking me what happened, and I tried to explain, but honestly, I was too shaken to go into much detail. I just told him enough so he wouldn't press too hard. Once we were back at work, I decided to report the incident to the police, just to be safe. At first, I felt a little silly, like maybe I was overreacting, but the way that guy had followed me through the store and waited outside, it wasn't normal. It wasn't something I could just shrug off. When I explained everything to the officer, he took me seriously right away. I described the guy as best as I could. The big backpack, his scruffy clothes, the way he just lingered and stared. The officer asked a few questions, then mentioned that they'd received similar reports recently about someone matching his description. Apparently, this guy had been targeting distracted shoppers, stealing their bags or purses when they weren't paying attention. The officer said I was likely his next target, but he backed off when he realized I was paying attention and wasn't alone when I left. Hearing that left me feeling both relieved and freaked out. On one hand, I was glad nothing worse happened. On the other, the thought of being followed like that, knowing he was planning something, still makes my skin crawl. He wasn't just wandering around the store aimlessly. He had a plan, and I was part of it. The way he kept watching me, waiting, it was calculated. That's what really sticks with me. Even now, I can't walk into stores like that without feeling a little on edge. I catch myself scanning the aisles, checking if anyone seems out of place or if someone might be watching me. It's exhausting, but I can't help it. That experience taught me to trust my gut, though. If something feels off, it probably is. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was to have noticed him and to have someone to call for help. Things could have gone very differently if I hadn't paid attention or if I'd left the store alone. What scares me the most is how normal everything felt until it wasn't. It was just a quick stop for office supplies, something I've done 100 times without a second thought. But that day, something changed. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't stayed aware, and honestly, I don't want to. It's one of those moments that keeps playing in my head, even now, as I try to move on. All I can say is, trust your instincts. They're there for a reason. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and my wife and I decided to take our two kids, Ethan, 7, and Lily, 4, to the Dollar Tree for some quick shopping. The store was close to home, and we liked going there to grab basic stuff and even a few cheap toys for the kids. It was one of those small, neatly organized stores with narrow aisles and shelves stacked to the ceiling. There weren't many people there that day, which was nice because the kids had a little more room to wander while we browsed. Everything seemed normal at first, but that feeling disappeared the moment we noticed this one strange employee arranging some items in the aisle next to us. He was by himself, leaning over a shelf of candy, but what caught our attention was that he was talking to himself. It wasn't the kind of absent-minded muttering people sometimes do. It was more like he was whispering to someone, pausing between phrases and glancing around. He looked a little unkempt, messy hair, wrinkled uniform, and his hands were trembling slightly as he moved the items around. When he noticed us, he froze, staring at us for a few seconds before giving this weird smile. Something about that smile made my wife uncomfortable, and she instinctively pulled the kids closer. At that moment, I figured he might just be a nervous or exhausted worker. But as we moved from aisle to aisle, I realized he seemed to be following us. At first, I thought maybe it was a coincidence. I mean, the store wasn't that big, and maybe he was just rearranging different sections. But it became obvious that wasn't the case when I noticed he wasn't even touching the shelves anymore. He'd just stand there, staring. The most unsettling part was how his eyes seemed glued to the kids. It wasn't casual. It felt like he was studying their every move. Ethan noticed too and whispered, "Why is that man looking at us like that?" I tried to brush it off, but my wife grabbed his arm and told us all to stick together. That uneasy feeling kept building, and I was already thinking about wrapping up our shopping as quickly as possible. When we finally got to the checkout, he stood off to the side, almost hiding, but I could feel his eyes on us the whole time. It was like he was waiting for something. My wife was visibly uncomfortable, and even the kids were quieter than usual. As soon as we got to the parking lot, I thought the weirdness was over, but I was wrong. While we were loading bags into the trunk, he appeared out of nowhere with that same creepy smile on his face. He stood there, hands clasped in front of him, and said, "Need a hand with those? Looks like a lot." His tone was calm, almost rehearsed, and even though my wife firmly replied, "No, thank you," he didn't budge. He just stayed there, staring at us like we owed him something. At that moment, I started to feel genuinely threatened. He didn't seem like he was going to leave, even after we made it clear we didn't need help. So, I decided to be more direct. I said something like, "We've got it handled. You can head back inside." He stared at me for a few seconds with that blank expression, then took a step closer. That's when I realized he was trying to peek into the car, specifically at where the kids were sitting. Ethan and Lily started asking what was going on, and my wife quickly shut the car door, telling me to hurry up with the bags. My heart was racing, and adrenaline was kicking in. Something about this guy was way off. Once I finished loading the trunk, I walked toward the driver's seat, but before I could get in, the guy grabbed the passenger side door handle, right next to where my wife was sitting. It happened so fast I could barely process it. My wife screamed, "What are you doing?" And I immediately ran around the car to put myself between him and the door. "Let go now," I shouted, trying to stay calm, but my voice was shaking. He didn't let go right away. Instead, he just stood there staring at me with those empty eyes, like he was trying to decide what to do next. It wasn't until I started yelling for someone to call security that he finally let go and took a few steps back. Before I could even think about what to do next, a store security guard came running over. He was a big guy, wearing a slightly tight vest, and you could tell he immediately sensed something was wrong. As soon as he got close, I asked, "Does this guy work here?" The guard looked at him, who now seemed fidgety, rubbing his hands together, and said hesitantly, "Yeah, but he's not supposed to be out here." I explained what had just happened while my wife tried to calm the kids down inside the car. The guard asked the man to go back into the store, but he didn't seem like he wanted to. He just kept mumbling, "I was just trying to help, just trying to help," in this unsettling, rehearsed way that made the whole thing feel even creepier. After some tense back and forth, the guard finally managed to get him to go back inside. Even so, I stood there for a few more minutes, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. My wife, still in the car, told me we should just leave immediately. I agreed, but before driving off, I decided to go back into the store and talk to the manager. I wanted to make sure they knew what was going on and that something would be done about it. To my surprise, the manager didn't look shocked at all. He sighed and said, "You're not the first person to complain about him." That only made me angrier. How could someone like that still have a job there? The manager explained that they'd received complaints about that employee before, but he always insisted it was just a misunderstanding, so they hadn't taken any serious action yet. "But this has gone way too far," he said, shaking his head. Even though he promised to file a report and escalate the issue to the corporate office, I wasn't confident anything would change. I went back to the car, and my wife was still visibly shaken. The kids, even though they didn't fully understand what had happened, were unusually quiet. On the drive home, we kept discussing what else we could have done and whether we should take further action. That night, still feeling uneasy, I decided to look up more about the store and the employee. To my surprise, I found a local forum where other people had shared similar experiences at different Dollar Tree locations. Some even described a man that matched the appearance of the one we encountered. That just solidified my decision to make an official complaint. I sent a detailed report to the company's customer service and even considered contacting the police. But the manager had assured me they'd handle it internally. While we never saw that man again, the whole experience left our family more cautious. To this day, we avoid that store entirely and are much more vigilant about any strange behavior in public places. It's unsettling to think how quickly something as routine as shopping can take a dark turn. That encounter was a harsh reminder to always trust your instincts, especially when it comes to the safety of your family. That night felt like any other. I suddenly remembered I needed cleaning supplies for my apartment, and since it was already past 10 p.m., Dollar Tree seemed like my only option. It wasn't my usual time for errands, but my week at college had been a total mess, and this was the only chance I had. When I got there, the parking lot was almost empty, just a few scattered cars. Inside, the place was as quiet as you'd expect. Those flickering fluorescent lights and only a couple of employees stacking shelves in the back. I grabbed a basket and headed straight to the cleaning aisle. That's when I noticed him. He didn't have a basket and didn't seem like he was looking for anything in particular. He was just there, wandering. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone or killing time. But every time I moved to a different aisle, there he was again. He wasn't close enough to really freak me out, but he was always in my line of sight, like he was keeping track of me. I stopped in front of a shelf, pretending to browse, just to see what he'd do. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him stop too. Just a few feet away, hands in his pockets. He wasn't picking anything up, wasn't even pretending to shop. He was just watching. That's when the unease started to creep in. But I tried to convince myself I was just overthinking it. I mean, who does something like that in a store this ordinary, at such a random time? I grabbed everything I needed and headed to the checkout, trying to shake off the discomfort. The guy was still wandering the aisles, but as I paid for my stuff, I noticed he had stopped near the exit, just standing there, like he was waiting for something. My chest tightened. But I kept telling myself he was just a weirdo, nothing more. I grabbed my bags, took a deep breath, and walked out of the store, glancing over my shoulder. To my relief, he wasn't there anymore, or so I thought at the time. I started walking down the quiet sidewalk, focusing on the sound of my own footsteps, trying to ignore the paranoia bubbling inside me. But then I heard it. Footsteps behind me, matching my pace. I turned my head slightly, trying not to be obvious, and there he was. He was walking at the same steady speed, keeping this weird, calculated distance from me. My stomach churned, and it hit me. He was following me. I told myself to stay calm. The street was empty, and running might only make things worse. Then I spotted a small grocery store still open on the other side of the road. Without thinking, I crossed the street and went inside, hoping that would be enough to make him go away. Once I got inside the grocery store, I felt a tiny sense of relief. It was brightly lit, and there were a handful of people shopping. For a moment, it felt like I was safe. But when I glanced back at the glass door, I saw him. He was standing on the sidewalk outside, staring right at me. He didn't try to come in. He didn't do anything. He just stood there, completely still. My heart started racing all over again. I walked through the aisles, pretending to browse, but my mind was spinning. My phone had died earlier in the evening, so I couldn't call anyone. Not the police, not even a friend. I decided to approach the store's security guard, who was standing near the entrance. He was an older guy, and I quickly explained what was happening, keeping my voice low so the guy outside wouldn't notice. The guard looked outside, saw the man, and gave me a nod, like he'd dealt with this kind of thing before. "Stay inside. I'll walk you to the police station. He won't follow you there," he said, calm but firm. I felt a wave of relief, but as I thought about walking those dark streets to the station, my nerves kicked in again. I didn't know what this guy was capable of, but it was clear this wasn't some misunderstanding. After a few minutes, the guard signaled that it was time to leave. He seemed confident, but his posture showed he was ready for anything. As soon as we stepped outside, the man started walking again, keeping a deliberate distance. It was like he wasn't afraid of being seen. He was focused, determined. My stomach twisted. The guard kept a steady pace and told me to stick close to him. The street felt endless, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the quiet night. My chest was tight with fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. When we finally reached the police station, the man stopped abruptly at the corner, just out of sight of the building. He stood there, watching us, as if deciding his next move. My entire body was on edge. Inside the station, I explained everything to the officers, my voice shaky. The guard backed me up, describing what he'd seen. One of the officers went outside to check, but by then the man was gone. They reassured me that they'd investigate and told me to stay alert, but their words didn't exactly calm me down. The fact that he had been so calculated made it worse. It wasn't random. He had a plan, and I just happened to be part of it that night. That night, I finally made it home, but I couldn't shake the fear. I kept glancing over my shoulder even as I got into a cab near the station. Inside my apartment, I locked every door and window, checking them over and over to be sure. I sat on my couch, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. Every sound from outside made me jump, and I couldn't stop picturing that guy standing on the sidewalk, staring at me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I'd open them and see him standing in my room. A few days later, the police called me. They said they had identified the man. Apparently, he'd been reported multiple times for following people in the area. They said he never did anything illegal enough to get arrested. He just followed people, always keeping his distance but close enough to make them feel unsafe. It seemed like he enjoyed scaring people, testing their boundaries. To this day, I still think about that night. I don't know what could have happened if I hadn't gone into that grocery store, or if the guard hadn't been there to help. Even now, I feel uneasy walking alone at night. That experience left a mark on me, and the worst part is knowing that someone like him could still be out there, watching. If you enjoyed the stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our work, and never miss the next ones. Thank you.